He yelled at his mother and intimidated his daughter. But when his adopted son, a soldier, returned, the house was no longer the same. Subscribe so you don't miss any new stories. And write in the comments which city you are from. The late evening sun bled across the quiet neighborhood, staining the narrow road in hues of gold and rust. Birds had already taken their final flights for the day, and a stillness settled like dust over the faded rooftops. In a small house at the far end of the lane, the windows flickered with a soft orange glow, but inside there was no peace. Rufina moved carefully through her kitchen, her legs aching beneath her. She had spent the entire day in service of others, not her own family, not even herself. At dawn, she'd gone to the neighbor's house, a frail woman with trembling hands and weak eyes, to help administer her insulin and change her bedding. After that, she'd queued for hours at the pharmacy, then walked back slowly, arms heavy with groceries and a mind weighed down by the thought of home. She had hoped to get dinner done before her son arrived, but time had escaped her. The yam she had meant to boil sat in the basket untouched. The pot was only just now beginning to heat, and the fish she had planned to fry remained on a tray, waiting. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the oil, pouring it into the pan with practiced caution. The sizzle startled her, even though she was expecting it. Her back throbbed, her eyes stung with tiredness, and the muscles in her arms twitched from the weight of a long day. But she said nothing. She never did. In the corner of the dining room, her granddaughter Liana sat bent over a textbook, though she hadn't turned a page in nearly half an hour. Her pencil hovered over a blank notebook, and her eyes flicked repeatedly toward the front door. Her small shoulders were tense, and her feet tapped nervously against the wooden floor. Rufina noticed, but didn't speak. The girl was young, but she was not blind to the rhythms of the house, the kind of silence that preceded a storm, the quiet pacing of fear that always set in before Kevin came home. The front gate groaned open with a slow, scraping sound. Then came the unmistakable footsteps, heavy, uneven, and impatient. Rufina's breath caught. She dropped the fish into the pan and tried to steel herself. The scent of oil and spice filled the room, but not quickly enough to mask the tension crackling in the air. The front door burst open. Kevin walked in, his shirt wrinkled and unbuttoned halfway down, sweat gleaming on his forehead. He stopped just past the threshold, glancing at the dining table empty and bare. He inhaled sharply through his nose and exhaled like steam from a kettle. Liana's pencil slipped from her fingers. Rufina didn't need to look. She could feel her son's anger as surely as heat from an open flame. "Where's the food?" Kevin's voice was not loud, but it was sharp enough to cut the air. Rufina wiped her hands on the hem of her faded apron and stepped into the doorway, her expression soft, apologetic. "I just got back from the pharmacy, Kevin. I had to check on Mrs. Bello this morning." "Is Mrs. Bello your husband now?" Kevin interrupted. His voice rose, his posture stiffening. "You run around playing nurse for every dying old woman in this neighborhood, but can't cook a damn meal for your own family?" Liana flinched. "I'm cooking," Rufina said, more to herself than to him. "I just started the fish." Kevin stormed past her into the kitchen, the smell of sizzling oil hitting him full force. But it didn't calm him. It never did. "What do you do all day, huh?" he barked. "Sit around with your holy books? Waste time gossiping with those jobless neighbors? Look at this house. Nothing's ever ready when I come home." Rufina clutched her apron tighter, her voice quiet and controlled. "You know I don't rest, Kevin. I help where I can. The food's almost ready. Just a few more minutes." He stared at her. The disgust on his face was a heavy, ugly thing. Then suddenly he reached for the ladle in her hand and flung it to the floor with a metallic clang. "You don't respect me," he spat. "You think I'm stupid? That I don't see how you favor that soldier boy? The one you plucked off the street and called your son?" Rufina's lips parted to respond, but she never got the chance. His hand lashed out with terrifying speed, connecting with the side of her face. The sound was small but sharp, like a book slammed shut. Rufina stumbled back, catching herself on the edge of the counter. Her glasses slid down her nose and clattered to the ground. The frame cracked. She didn't cry out. She didn't even look at him. Her hand pressed against her cheek, more in disbelief than pain. Across the room, Liana screamed. She rushed to her grandmother's side, crouching beside her, clutching her arm. Her face was pale, her mouth trembling. Kevin turned toward her, his chest rising and falling, but said nothing. He muttered something unintelligible, shoved his way past them both, and collapsed into a chair in the living room. He turned on the television and raised the volume as if it could erase what had just happened. Rufina picked up her glasses with unsteady fingers, inspecting the damage. One lens was smudged with oil and trembling reflection. She didn't speak. Liana clung to her, whispering something Rufina couldn't hear through the ringing in her ears. She patted the girl's head gently and forced a small, lopsided smile. "We'll be fine," she said, though even she wasn't sure she believed it. And then, without warning, the front door creaked again, slowly, heavily. A tall man stepped into the threshold. His boots were coated in dust, his army-issued duffel slung over one shoulder. His uniform, though worn from travel, was neat, his collar still buttoned. His skin was darker from time in the sun, his face leaner than Rufina remembered. But the moment she saw him, her breath caught again, this time in shock. "Marco!" The name came out in a gasp. Liana's eyes went wide, recognition dawning through her tears. Kevin finally looked up. His face shifted from confusion to something like surprise, then quickly melted into a counterfeit smile. He stood and spread his arms wide, suddenly filled with performative joy. "Well, look who decided to show up," Kevin said, voice loud and falsely warm. "The prodigal son himself. What, no call? No message? You nearly gave Mama a heart attack." Marco didn't respond. His eyes moved from Rufina's reddened cheek to Liana's frightened posture, then back to Kevin. His jaw tightened. The room was full of sound television chatter, frying oil, distant street noise, but between the three of them, only silence passed. Rufina stepped forward, recovering her composure. She reached out and touched Marco's sleeve. Her hand lingered there, as if to anchor herself. "Come in, my son," she said softly. "You're home." Marco nodded once. He placed his bag gently beside the door, then leaned down to embrace Liana. She clutched him fiercely, burying her face in his chest. His hand moved protectively over her back, and in his eyes something ancient stirred. Rage, sadness, memory. Kevin clapped him on the back, trying to steer him toward the table. "Let's eat. You must be starving. Sit. Mama cooked something, didn't you, Mama?" Rufina returned to the stove, her hands robotic. She plated the now overcooked fish and set out the yam. The table was laid in silence. Kevin continued talking, bragging about nothing, making jokes no one laughed at. Marco watched it all. Every false note, every twitch in Liana's shoulders, every time Rufina winced slightly when she reached for a plate. He had returned home, yes. But what he'd stepped into wasn't a home. It was a house filled with fear, and something in him knew this wasn't just a bad night. This was something that had festered, slowly, over time. He said nothing, but he would. Soon. Morning came with a grayness that clung to the windows like mist, muffling the edges of the world and dulling even the birdsong. The small house remained quiet, its inhabitants moving through it as though navigating a dream, soft-footed, unsure, waiting for something to shatter the fragile stillness. Rufina stood in the kitchen again, as she had the night before. Her fingers wrapped around the handle of the kettle while the water inside trembled toward a boil. Her face bore the echo of Kevin's anger, though the swelling had faded slightly in the night. She wore a pair of older glasses now, thicker and scratched, the frame resting crookedly on her nose. They made her eyes look smaller, like she was trying to disappear behind the lenses. She hummed low under her breath, not a tune but a rhythm of movement, a lifeline to keep herself present. The table had already been set. Plates, mugs, a pot of yam porridge, a basket of bread rolls warmed in the oven. Everything arranged with care, perhaps too much care, as though order could somehow compensate for what the house had become. Upstairs, Liana lay curled beneath her blanket, her eyes open. She hadn't slept well. She had heard her grandmother's quiet footsteps during the night, had seen the flicker of the hallway light beneath her door, had listened for Marco's boots creaking the floorboards. She hadn't heard Kevin come back up after dinner. That had given her a little peace, just a little. She didn't want to come down, but she also didn't want to leave Marco alone with them. When she finally rose and dressed, she moved quietly, like someone sneaking through enemy territory. Her footsteps made no sound on the wooden stairs. As she reached the bottom, she saw Marco already seated at the table. He was upright, freshly washed, dressed in a clean black t-shirt and simple jeans. His eyes lifted when he saw her, and he smiled just enough to remind her that he was still the same man who used to braid her hair when she was 6. Kevin entered the room next, loud as ever. His shirt was wrinkled again and his belt loose, but his voice was bright with a forced cheerfulness that clashed with the morning air. "Smells good in here," he said, rubbing his hands together. "Mama always knows how to feed her boys." Rufina managed a tight smile. "Sit. Eat while it's hot." Kevin sat next to Marco and clapped him on the back. "So, big man, how's military life treating you? You still crawling through mud and dodging bullets?" Marco nodded once, spooning porridge into his bowl. "Something like that." Kevin laughed too loud. "Must be nice. No rent, no bills, no wife nagging at you about gas money. I tell you, if I didn't have responsibilities here, I might have joined myself back in the day." No one responded. Marco ate slowly, his eyes flicking between Rufina and Liana. He watched how the girl barely touched her food, how Rufina kept glancing at the clock, though they had nowhere to be. He noticed the way Kevin's voice filled every pause, how he dominated the room like a performance artist on a cracked stage. When breakfast ended, Kevin leaned back and announced that he was going to take a short nap. Said his head hurt, probably from the heat. Rufina offered to bring him tea, but he waved her off and retreated to the living room, muttering to himself. Once he was gone, silence settled like dust again. Liana began clearing the table, stacking plates with delicate movements. Marco stood to help her, and when their hands met over the pot, he placed his palm lightly on hers. "You okay?" he asked, voice barely above a whisper. She didn't answer. Instead, she nodded, though her eyes welled up, and she blinked hard. He said nothing more, only helped her carry the dishes to the sink. Rufina stood watching them, towel in hand, and for a moment all three of them moved in quiet harmony, a broken trio trying to piece themselves back together with silence. Later that morning, Marco suggested they go outside for a walk. Liana hesitated, but Rufina nodded, and that was enough. They strolled slowly down the street, not talking at first. Marco let the girl take her time. He asked small questions. How was school? What was she reading? Did she still draw? She answered in monosyllables, her voice tight. But then, slowly, her answers lengthened. She told him about a project at school, about a friend who had moved away, about how she missed the way things used to be. And then, almost casually, she said something that made Marco stop walking. "Sometimes I pretend he's not my dad." He didn't speak. He didn't need to. I mean, when he yells like that, or when he throws things, or when he gets that look in his eyes, it's like he's not even in there anymore. Marco crouched down beside her, eye level. "You're not crazy for thinking that," he said, "and you're not alone." She bit her lip, nodded, and wiped her nose. They continued their walk, the silence now gentler between them. Back at the house, Kevin had fallen asleep on the couch with the television still playing. Rufina sat in her armchair, sewing a tear in one of Liana's school shirts. When Marco and the girl returned, she looked up and her expression softened. Liana walked straight to her and leaned into her side. Rufina kissed her forehead, then glanced up at Marco. "She talked," she said softly. Marco gave a nod. That evening, the dinner was quieter than breakfast, and Kevin barely spoke. He seemed drained, his energy flickering. At one point, he tried to start a conversation about politics, but no one joined in. He gave up quickly, retreated into his stew. After the meal, Marco asked to speak with him privately. They stood in the backyard, beneath the canopy of the large mango tree that had shaded their childhood games. The branches rustled overhead, the air warm but still. Kevin leaned against the wall with his arms crossed, waiting. "I saw what you did last night," Marco began. Kevin didn't answer. "I didn't come home to fight, Kevin, but I also didn't come home to ignore it." Kevin scoffed. "You're here one day and you think you know everything?" "I know enough," Marco said. Kevin's voice rose. "You have no idea what I deal with. No job, bills piling up, people talking behind your back. Mama doesn't help. She always takes your side." That girl's growing up too fast. Everyone acts like I'm the bad guy. Marco took a step closer, calm but unflinching. You're not the bad guy, Kevin, but you are acting like one. You don't hit your mother. You don't scare your daughter. Kevin turned away. It was one time. Marco's voice hardened. You and I both know it wasn't. Kevin swallowed hard. His jaw clenched. He said nothing more. When Marco re-entered the house, he found Rufina washing dishes, her sleeves rolled to the elbows, arms red from scrubbing. He stepped beside her and took the plate from her hands. I can finish this, he said. She looked at him with a small, grateful smile. Later, before bed, Marco stood outside Liana's door. He knocked gently and stepped in when she called. She sat on the bed with a book open, though she wasn't reading. He knelt beside her. You were brave today, he said. She nodded. Will it get better? He reached out and brushed a stray curl from her forehead. Not overnight, but I'm here now, and things will change. She leaned forward, hugging him fiercely. He stayed with her until she fell asleep, then returned to his own room. He stood by the window for a long time, watching the moon rise behind the clouds. The house was still, but the stillness no longer felt like silence. It felt like a pause, the kind that comes before someone decides to speak the truth. And he would. Tomorrow. The house stood beneath a sky-stained violet, the air heavy with the promise of rain. The air inside was warmer still, not from weather but from things unspoken, things trapped in the walls. Marco woke before the others, as he always did. He sat outside on the small cement step beside the doorway, sipping tea from an old enamel mug and listening to the wind push gently through the leaves of the mango tree. His thoughts were steady, but not still. The conversations from the day before echoed inside him. Liana's quiet confession, Rufina's silence, Kevin's rage masked in excuses. He'd seen war before. He had known violence, had faced fear and loss. But something about the tension in this house felt heavier, more dangerous in its quiet. Fear in uniform could be met with force, but fear in a child's eyes that was a different battlefield entirely. By the time Rufina rose and began to move around the kitchen, Marco was already dressed. She greeted him with a soft nod. They shared no words, but a look passed between them, an understanding that today, something needed to shift. Rufina's shoulders slumped more than usual, and her lips looked chewed at the corners from long nights of biting back words. She moved slower than she had the day before. There was a weariness in her steps that could no longer be explained by age. Liana came downstairs late. She looked tired too, but her hair was combed and her uniform tidy. She kissed her grandmother on the cheek, gave Marco a small smile, and sat quietly at the table. When Kevin entered, the mood shifted like a shadow moving across the floor. His presence filled the room with unease, even when he said nothing. He mumbled a greeting, poured himself a cup of tea, and began eating with deliberate clatter. Marco didn't speak, neither did Rufina. Liana, already tense, became motionless. Kevin tapped his spoon against his bowl. Then he frowned at Liana. You haven't finished your homework, have you? I did, she answered quickly, not looking up. Then why was your notebook still open when I came home yesterday? It was for revision, she said softly. Kevin's voice grew sharper. Don't lie to me. Marco's eyes flicked up. Rufina interjected calmly. She stayed up late studying. I saw her. Kevin grunted. Maybe if she spent less time drawing those stupid cartoons and more time with her nose in books, she wouldn't be struggling in school. Liana's cheeks flushed. She lowered her spoon and set her hands in her lap. Marco's fingers curled tightly around his mug. I'm not struggling, Liana said, barely above a whisper. Kevin slammed his hand against the table. Then speak up when I talk to you. You think sulking makes you groan? Don't try me, Liana. The girl jolted. Her shoulders tensed, and her eyes brimmed instantly with tears. That's enough, Marco said, his voice steady but hard. Kevin looked up, expression dark. Don't interfere with my daughter. Marco didn't flinch. Then be a father worth respecting. The room froze. Rufina turned slowly, her face pale. Liana stood, knocking over her chair. I can't take it, she cried, her voice breaking as she ran out of the room. Liana! Rufina called, already moving after her. But the girl didn't stop. She burst through the front door and down the steps, barefoot, arms flailing as she darted into the open street. Rufina chased after her, fear overtaking age. Marco was already out the door, following close behind. Kevin stood rooted, stunned, the breakfast still steaming on the table. Liana ran like the fear itself was chasing her, not a person. Her steps were frantic, unmeasured, as though her body was trying to flee her life. She reached the main road, her eyes wild, not seeing the stones in her path. Her foot caught on one, and she flew forward with a strangled cry, tumbling across the asphalt and hitting the ground hard. Her head struck first. Her body curled in on itself, still. Rufina screamed. Marco reached her first. He knelt, checking for breath, for movement. Her pulse was there, but faint. Her forehead was bleeding, her knees scraped raw. "She's breathing," he said, steady but tight. "We need to get her to the hospital." Rufina sobbed, pressing her hand to her chest, rocking slightly. Kevin finally appeared behind them, panting, eyes wide in horror. He dropped beside his daughter and reached for her, but Marco stopped him with one look. "Don't touch her," Marco said coldly. "Help get a car." Kevin obeyed without protest, staggering toward a neighbor's house. Minutes later, they bundled Liana into a borrowed taxi, Marco cradling her head, Rufina holding her hand. Kevin sat silently in the corner, hands clasped so tightly his knuckles had turned white. At the hospital, time stretched. The waiting room smelled of antiseptic and sorrow. The nurse led them to a hallway where they sat on plastic chairs, waiting to be called in. Rufina sat beside Marco, her fingers wrapped tightly around her own wrist, as if trying to stop herself from falling apart. Kevin paced the length of the corridor, then returned to sit, then rose again. He didn't speak. His eyes were red. He looked like a man who had suddenly realized he had walked off a cliff, and only now saw the ground rushing up to meet him. Marco watched him without sympathy. His mind returned to 100 moments in his past, men dying on dusty roads, calling out for their daughters, clutching photos to their chests. He had always believed that coming home meant peace. But peace had no place in a house ruled by fear. The doctor appeared, tall and tired-looking, a clipboard in his hand. He approached them, his expression unreadable. "She's stable," he said. "She hit her head, but there's no fracture. She has a mild concussion and some bruising. She'll be fine physically." Rufina exhaled sharply, tears spilling down her cheeks. The doctor continued. "But her blood pressure was elevated. She's under significant emotional stress. This didn't come from a single fall. This is cumulative. This child has been living in fear. Whatever's happening at home, it needs to change." He didn't wait for a response. He turned and walked away. Kevin sat down again, slowly, as if his knees had stopped working. He buried his face in his hands. For the first time in years, he didn't speak, didn't explain, didn't blame. He just sat there, breathing raggedly, letting the weight of everything he had broken settle around him. Rufina reached for Marco's arm. "I thought I was protecting her," she said. "I thought keeping quiet was better than making things worse." Marco shook his head. "We all thought that. But silence doesn't protect. It only hides the damage." They remained at the hospital until nightfall. When Liana opened her eyes at last, the first thing she saw was her grandmother's face, soft and worn, looking down with love and apology. Marco sat beside the bed, quiet and unmoving. Kevin hovered near the window, unable to look at either of them. Liana blinked slowly, then whispered, "Mama?" "I'm here," Rufina said, pressing her hand against the girl's cheek. "You're safe, baby. You're safe." Kevin turned then, finally. He took one step forward, but the look in Liana's eyes stopped him cold. It wasn't hate. It wasn't even fear. It was distance. That night they returned home. Liana was carried gently to her bed. Rufina sat with her, singing softly under her breath. Kevin stood in the hallway listening, but not entering. Marco leaned against the wall across from him. "I never meant for this," Kevin said. His voice was hoarse. "No one means for it," Marco replied, "but it happens all the same. I don't know how I became like this." Marco looked at him, then turned away. "You didn't become. You allowed. There's a difference." Kevin slid down the wall, sitting on the floor with his back to the plaster. He looked around the house as if seeing it for the first time. The cracked paint, the broken shelf in the corner, the shadows on the walls. "I don't know how to fix it." Marco's voice was quiet. "Then start by not breaking it any further." He walked away, leaving Kevin alone in the hallway. And for the first time, Kevin didn't rise to follow. Morning filtered through the curtains like a hesitant visitor, soft and pale. The hospital air had been cool, distant, sterile in its calm, but back at home the warmth felt hesitant, unsure of its welcome. Rufina stood by the window in the kitchen, her eyes tracing the pattern of morning light on the tiles. Her movements were slow, not from age but from the weight of everything that had passed. She hadn't changed out of her clothes from the night before. Her shawl hung loose around her shoulders. She had barely spoken since they returned, but she had not cried again. Her tears had been shed beside Liana's hospital bed, pressed into the small hands she had held through the night. Kevin hadn't slept. At some point, he had moved from the hallway floor to a chair in the living room. The television was off for once. He stared at the wall, face drawn and colorless. He heard the distant sounds of Rufina in the kitchen, but didn't move. There was a heaviness on his chest that he didn't know how to lift. His thoughts looped in circles, the doctor's words, Marco's quiet fury, Liana's small broken voice. The moment when she looked at him in the hospital, eyes wide but far away, stuck like a knife in his memory. She had not pushed him away. She had simply not reached for him at all. Marco stepped outside as the sun began to rise, his boots crunching softly against the gravel path. He stretched his arms behind his back and looked toward the road. The neighborhood was waking up slowly. A dog barked once down the street. Somewhere a kettle whistled. He returned inside with 2 cups of tea, placing one in front of Rufina, without a word, and the other in front of Kevin. Kevin looked up at him for the first time that day, surprised, but Marco had already turned away. Liana was still asleep when Rufina checked on her. The girl's forehead was cool, her breath steady. The bruises on her knees had darkened overnight, but the color was fading around the edges. Rufina smoothed the blanket over her and stood still for a long time, watching her granddaughter's chest rise and fall. She reached down and brushed a lock of hair from the girl's cheek. A part of her wanted to believe that if she just stood still long enough, the pain of the last days would evaporate like morning dew. In the late morning, the family gathered at the table. The meal was quiet. Marco ate slowly. Rufina served without comment. Kevin didn't touch his food. Liana, pale but stronger, came out of her room and sat beside her grandmother. She didn't look at her father. He tried not to look at her either. There were too many things in his face now. Shame, guilt, the fragile beginnings of understanding. After the dishes had been cleared, Marco stood and turned to Kevin. "Let's talk," he said. Kevin looked up, uncertain, but nodded. They went outside into the backyard, the ground still soft from last night's drizzle. The mango tree offered shade, and the air was thick with the scent of wet earth. Marco leaned against the tree while Kevin stood awkwardly, hands stuffed in his pockets. "You used to be my hero," Marco said finally. "When I was a boy, you taught me how to throw a punch, taught me how to fight bullies. I thought no one could hurt me when you were around." Kevin's mouth opened slightly, but he said nothing. "But now I look at you," Marco continued, "and I see a man who became the very thing he used to fight. You're the one they need protecting from, and that's not what being a man means." Kevin's voice was low. "I don't know how it happened. I don't know when." "Yes, you do," Marco said. "You let life beat you down, and instead of standing up and facing it, you took it out on the people closest to you. That's not strength, Kevin. That's cowardice." Kevin's fists clenched at his sides. He looked away. "I lost my job," he said. "I lost money. I lost control. I was angry all the time, and I told myself that no one understood, that I had to carry it alone." Marco's expression didn't soften. "And so you made them carry it with you. You made a child flinch when you walked in the room. You made an old woman afraid of her own son." Kevin's voice cracked. "I didn't mean to." "Then stop doing it." Kevin sank onto the bench beneath the tree, burying his face in his hands. His shoulders shook, not from cold but from the weight of it all. Marco watched him for a long time before finally sitting beside him. "You can't fix everything overnight," Marco said, "but you can start, and you can keep going." Inside, Rufina washed the dishes slowly. Her hands trembled more than usual. She was thinking again about the night she had packed a bag. She had folded her things carefully, tucked money into the side pocket, written a short note and tucked it into Liana's shoe where she would find it later. She had stood in the hallway, bag in hand, looking at the door, and told herself she would leave, that she had to. But she hadn't. She had stayed, hoping, praying, compromising. And now she wasn't sure whether to be ashamed or grateful. She dried her hands, took a deep breath, and turned around, only to find Kevin standing behind her. He looked different. Not like someone changed, not yet, but like someone beginning to see the world with different eyes. "I'm sorry," he said. His voice was low, steady. "I've hurt you. I've hurt her. I got lost somewhere, and I let that loss make me cruel. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I need you to know that I want to change. I need to." Rufina said nothing at first. She just looked at him, taking in the bruises on his pride, the cracks in his voice. "Change isn't words," she said at last. "It's action. It's every day. It's what you do when no one's watching." He nodded. "I know." That evening, for the first time, Kevin set the table. It wasn't graceful. He fumbled the plates, dropped a fork, but he did it. Rufina cooked in silence, watching him out of the corner of her eye. Marco helped without being asked. Liana came out of her room and took her seat quietly. Dinner was simple: rice and beans, plantain slices, a small salad. Kevin didn't speak much, but he listened. He looked at Liana when she spoke, thanked his mother for the food, and before the meal ended, he stood and faced them all. "I know one dinner doesn't fix anything," he said, "but I'm going to keep trying. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm asking you to give me time to earn it." Liana didn't answer, but she looked at him, really looked, for the first time since the hospital. There was no warmth in her eyes, not yet, but there was something else, a flicker of curiosity perhaps, of hope. After dinner, Marco packed his things. He folded his uniforms carefully, laced his boots, zipped the duffel bag with practiced motion. He came into the living room where Rufina sat with a knitting needle and an unfinished scarf. She stood and hugged him tightly. "You were always my son," she whispered. "You made me that," he replied. Liana hugged him next, holding on for a moment longer than expected. Then he turned to Kevin. They didn't hug, but they stood face to face. Two men not yet whole, but no longer strangers to one another. "Home is a battlefield too," Marco said. "But you don't win by fighting your family. You win by protecting them." Kevin nodded. "I'll remember that." Marco slung his bag over his shoulder and walked out into the night. The road stretched long ahead of him, and his boots echoed on the gravel. But behind him, the house didn't feel the same. The silence had changed. It wasn't heavy anymore. It was calm. That night, Rufina and Liana slept peacefully. Kevin sat in the kitchen alone, a notebook open in front of him. He began to write a list. Things to change, things to repair, things to do better. His handwriting was shaky at first, but as the list grew, his lines became firmer. He looked at the closed bedroom door and whispered, "Thank you." And for the first time in a long time, he believed it. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more. Watch our next video. Each one tells a truth worth hearing. And please share this with someone who needs it.